and we're going to suggest 3 topics of about 15-20 minutes each. The first has to do with the church, the nature of the church, and whether our perception of that nature is changing. It has to do with church buildings, of course, as well. The second topic has to do with human nature and what the pandemic has revealed in terms of our understanding of human nature at this time. And the third topic is about leadership, our leadership and the leadership under which we have sat and what we've discovered about what it involves. Robert and I are hoping that this is about sowing seeds, flying kites. It's not going to be about conclusions, it's about ideas. If it's abstract and unsatisfactory, it's because we're not arguing something logically, we are simply thinking aloud. Hope you're okay with that kind of format. Robert, I want to throw you a question. We've got 10 minutes to talk about the changing nature of church. This might be to do with your church, it might be more abstract and general than that. In 1 Peter 2, we are described as living stones being built together into God's dwelling place. That is to say, the church is people. I want to ask you, what have you discovered about the nature of church during this time of virtual interaction and worship? What has changed?
I think the enormous possibilities that have come with recording, online, live streaming, that's changed. I had never heard Zoom 3 months ago, and now it's bread and butter. But we are people. And one of the things I've been aware of is how much can be missing from live stream services. There's enormous opportunity within it, but what's missing is I can't touch, I can't see, I can't smell, I can't do all those physical things that go naturally when we quite literally congregate. As a congregation, it's in some ways a very physical gathering, and all that is really missed in Zoom. You know, the chatter that usually happens at the beginning of a service, that's missing. If, whatever, 65 of us now on screen, if we all started chattering, it would be chaos. So that's part of what's missing. And I think there's something else. I've been thinking about how tired we all get with online services or meetings. It requires a very great deal of concentration. And so there's a part of worship that is actually about letting go. Worship is about Sabbathing. It's about acknowledging that God is in charge. By the time of the dismissal at the end of a Eucharist, we are sent out and we need to, as it were, put on our body armor again and get ready to go. But during worship, there's rightly a time we should, as members of the congregation, be meandering and relaxing. It's said that church is a place where all our loose ends meet. And I find Zoom is so much more, or live streaming is so much more concentrated.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I'm interested in your picture of worship. Sounds quite passive, or it could be accused of being quite passive. One of my problems with Zoom is that it turns us in, well, for those of us who are following the Zoom rather than leading the Zoom, it turns us into consumers. You know, we might as well be going to the cinema to watch a show.
Absolutely, and that's why we didn't know about breakout rooms for a couple of weeks, but we found how much people really appreciate those at the end of worship. And actually the first time we've been leading live stream worship in about half an hour. After an hour of breakout rooms, we had to ask people to go and cook the lunch because I had other things to do, because that's what they want. They want interaction. And that's why we prefer live streaming rather than recording, because at least there's somewhere, you know, I can see faces on screen now. You're right that worship is absolutely, essentially, we are involved and active.
So we're getting to the level of talking about tips for virtual worship, you know, how to manage Zoom or Facebook Live or whatever it is. How, to my mind, worship or liturgy is something we perform in community. And by we, I don't just mean the clergy. It's something we engage in together. How can, I mean, is it an issue owing to virtual worship that the church has turned into something that is more clergy-led?
I think there's two dynamics there, both of which are potentially worrying. One is that it's clergy-led, and the other is that it's focused on active worshippers. And what that does not leave space for are the people who drop in unexpected. The image I like to use is at a Passover meal, you've always got to leave a spare chair for Elijah. Where are the Elijahs? You can't really leave a chair for Elijah in a Zoom meeting. It's very hard to do that. So it's not just clergy-led, but actually even the congregation can be so clear-cut that we miss those fuzzy boundaries.
And when I say clergy-led, I think I mean professional-led, because obviously depending on churchmanship, we flip to the worship leader or the choir doing their piece. And the danger is that people who aren't in either of those are on the chat, commenting, and I dare say on the quality. What a wonderful, clever coordination of voices, each from their homes, or what a fantastic quality of sound is coming over from the band. I wonder what you want to say about that. It feels a little bit to me like a commentary on a political speech. You know, I agree with what they say. They're speaking terribly well. Again, we're getting very professional about worship.
The story, I think you absolutely put your finger on it. So one of the things that's missing is that the passive congregation can comment, but what they can't do is feed in their interests and their questions. And for me, one of the so important stories actually came up in morning prayer a couple of weeks ago. Joshua crossing the River Jordan, you remember, and entering the promised land. And the key question that's asked is, what do these stones mean? And that was a question in the narrative that was not only asked in that generation, but in generations to come. They will say, what do these stones mean?
And that brings us on to buildings.
Brings us on to building. And buildings have always meant to be an invitation to the local community to come to the place and say, not just what do our stones mean, but what do you do about this? What do you do about forgiveness? What do you do about depression, anxiety, whatever? Church buildings, to me, are an invitation to a conversation. And as we reply to people's questions, we're trying to draw them into a spiritual conversation. None of that is made easy on Zoom.
While we're talking, I'd love Kate to float the poll, where the question is, what would you say your building has become more important as an expression of church during lockdown or not? It would be fascinating to hear. What would you say, Robert? Please go ahead and vote, and in a few moments, Kate will come up with the answer.
I would say, while people are voting, don't lose sight of the enormous potential that has recently been revealed to us, but actually go back to your buildings and your old way of doing things and see what is precious that has been missing. And not go back to the old ways, but go back to, as you re-enter and re-inhabit a building, what does it make possible?
Isn't that interesting? Okay, 70% say it hasn't become more important as an expression of church. Virtual church presumably has developed other notions of church. And here's where I just want to float one more thing. and this might send you off with thoughts to discuss in your breakout rooms. It seems to me that COVID has speeded up the move from the tangible physical focus, whether on a building or on people, to intangible virtual connections between people. And I wonder, Robert, you might want to comment on this, if it's not so much a question of which is more holy, but does that lead us to focus on different aspects of the Trinity? You know, Christ being one who is bound by place and time, the Spirit not bound by place and time. I wonder.
Yes, for me, the incarnation as the tangible, localized, physical presence, that phrase, the scandal of particularity, it is the here and now. Now, clearly, after Pentecost, the sending of God's Spirit, the here and now is everywhere. But actually, we lose contact with our faith history if we just generalize everything. Jesus was born 2,000 years ago, not in England, but in a different place. And I think we need to remember that in that sense, we are on the edge, we are fringe, and we mustn't domesticate it too much.
Okay, with that, folks, I'm going to suggest we break out so that you have chance to talk. And if you want a starting point, I would just ask you, has the lockdown altered your appreciation of the Trinity? Whether the Son who became physically incarnate and tangible, or the Spirit's intangible presence connecting and animating us as a church?
Welcome, everyone. And I have found that the lockdown period has been a time of sometimes overwhelming emotion. At times I felt enormously angry, and at times I felt enormously delighted. And that phrase, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So there you are, Bishop Joe. Has it been for you the best of times, the worst of times? And not just for you personally, but what you've seen in others?
Yeah. On a personal level, I've actually quite enjoyed it. Some of you know that as a family of four, we're normally in disparate places, and actually we've discovered we quite like spending time together, and it's been wonderful. But I have noticed this period feels to me like it's brought out the best and the worst in me and in our nation and in our world. Now, it may be that we've got far more time on our hands to engage and to follow what's going on and to emote, or more need to emote, because we're not having the normal social interactions that might take up some of those emotions. But it feels like the intensity of this period of lockdown has taken the lid off things. Let me just change the metaphor. Like lifting a stone and you discover in the dark underneath a whole lot of little creepy crawlies that you didn't want to see were there. Some of us are better off, some of us are worse off, and some of us are both, I think. When it comes to work, it seems to me utterly fascinating who's been working their socks off and who has barely been working, or their work has barely changed. It messes with my understanding or the established hierarchy among professions. The key workers, the absolutely vital people, tend to be those in lowest paid roles. The creatives, the people in finance in London, all of that's been pretty invisible. And frankly, I think we could have managed without them during this period. And so helpfully, it just turns a few priorities upside down, I think. I'd like to think it will turn some pay scales upside down.
And if I'm going to jump in there and say, let's assume just for the moment that it won't turn pay scales upside down, how might the church going forward show that it is associated with those who, beyond the NHS workers, health workers, those people who are nearly always poorly paid and invisible. And so for me, one of the groups are the street cleaners, the people who have still emptied the rubbish bins, the whatevers, the person who stands on security outside Sainsbury's. How might we signal our association and valuing of them?
That's a very direct, sort of empirical question, Robert, when I'm quite keen to keep the conversation theological. So part of me wants to turn it back to you, because I suspect you've got ideas. But I would note that all of those roles you've just named are just as vulnerable to infection as those working in the NHS. You know, our refuse collectors, who knows what it is they're handling? And wearing a mask in that context, you know, wouldn't last 2 minutes. You'd be changing a mask very regularly. We have to find a way to value them. And I think that's got to be more than standing at the bottom of our driveway clapping. Yeah. Have you got an answer, Robert? Do you want to float some suggestions?
I'm very pleased to have identified that as a question, and as a church, well, no, the serious bit is, as a church that hosts rather grand civic services and remembrance and for the High Sheriff and whatever, we never hold an annual service for the street cleaners and the security guards. And so in some ways, I find that a challenging liturgical and theological question to the sort of tradition in from Holy Trinity Guildford. I haven't got an answer yet, but I'm quite keen that we gather questions and don't try and jump immediately to answers.
And if I can speak to another dimension of the way in which extremes have been exacerbated, money. You know, we hear on the news a lot of stories. It was on Today programme this morning was all about Cornwall and how, you know, the bottom has fallen out of 70% of the local economy in Cornwall based on tourism. But I'm very aware in Surrey, a lot of people are better off. You know, they haven't been flying away on nice holidays. They haven't even been commuting into London. And yet there are very many people with secure jobs, possibly not even stressful jobs during this period. I know that's probably an unpopular thing to say. Meanwhile, we know, you know, plenty of spots in our economy are really struggling, particularly the third sector, the charitable sector, the non-profit sector.
Okay, if there's a theological phrase that has obviously come to great prominence recently that I still can't quite position yet, it's Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And in terms of what we've seen associated with that phrase, ranging from prophecy, glorious courage to original sin, I can't position it at the moment. What have you associated with that Black Lives Matter moments?
Thank you. Thank you, by the way, for not talking about Dominic Cummings, because I think Black Lives Matters is a much more substantial issue. Dominic Cummings is an issue about hypocrisy, and we're all guilty of that, and it's never very interesting, frankly. Black Lives Matters is not a story about statues, much as that, you know, the particulars catch the news. It's a story about dealing with the egregious problems that are deep-seated in our society and have been so for generations and centuries. Isn't it interesting that at this time of lockdown, we have the time and scope, I think, to engage with that? I hope more deeply than we ever would have were it normal times. Yes, George Floyd would have made the news, but the protests would not have been as big or as global, I would suggest. Now, I mean, on two things. That makes me wonder what other issues, deep-seated issues, we have neglected in society that we might wish to address. That might be about other minority groups. but I think what this pandemic is doing is providing an expose of human nature. We said the best and the worst, and what we're looking at here is deep-seated human sin that's corporate and personal, that we...
I think we might have lost Bishop Joe for the time being. Fine, could you take another 5 minutes on breakout rooms?
Hello, people. I'm assuming we'll come back together. It's fantastic to see your faces. You can't see my face except in a still, because I'm hoping that will sustain my internet connection. But I've invited Robert to take over completely, should I completely fade away, which is highly possible. Robert, I want to start this next section, this last section, talking about leadership in a time of crisis by throwing you a question, which is to say, thinking broadly, it might be across the church or the nation or the world. What has depressed you? Permission to sound off if you wish.
Okay, I heard every other word of that question. So what I'm going to, before I get on to what depressed me, I'm not the only person who will be saying that one of my role models over the last few months has been Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand. And just as I said in an earlier session, I don't just want to feel that, I want to think about why I'm doing that. And I think what's been said about her that I really admire is her sense of being able to empathize directly with people in difficulty, sympathize broadly with a whole range, and for her whole country, but especially to endorse and build up confidence in people's responsibility that they each person living in her country had a contribution to make to combating the pandemic. And I think that sense of feeling with people, but also giving them the authority and recognizing their power to make a difference really matters. And I suppose the contrast between that, the most obvious example for me as a school governor was to hear from the head teacher of our church school on the first day of the second half of term, so the day they came back with children from years R1 and 6, that during half term, she had received 31 different directives from the government, some of which were so radical that they had to change during half term the plan of how they were going to ease lockdown in school. Now, to my mind, that was not empowering. And I think for me, just trying to see those examples being played out in the press and in our country, I try and bring the messages home. So how does my leadership truly empower, not in terms of delegating jobs, but help people grow in confidence? I love the phrase that I read recently in this book from Mark Oakley. It's going to be on the bibliography we're going to send around later. The question simply is, who do people become in my presence? Who do people become in my presence? And to me, the emphasis is on helping people become more who they are. That's what leadership is about. And so my frustration over the last these weeks of crisis have been the times that leadership has been far more directive and trying to, in some ways, live my life for me, rather than requiring me to not only take responsibility, but to be imaginative and creative and bring the best.
I think I'm listening to you, although I'll admit my connection's coming and going. Kate, if you can hear out there, it would be fascinating to hear for others how they feel their leadership has changed during pandemic. Has it been enabled or disabled? Has it been creative or dispiriting?
A poll, 71% say that the pressures have been productive,
have been exciting, have been enabling.
yeah.
It feels to me like pandemic is a time for leadership. And it's interesting, Robert, to me that you've got frustrated with leadership. I've been thankful most broadly for leadership. And if it doesn't sound self-adulating, I have been aware of other people's thanks, even within the diocese, for this time of leadership. And it seems to me there's a few things I've learned, if I can just sound off. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, good.
By the way, folks, this is now plenary, and if you want to put questions in the chat or you want to make a contribution, in about 5 minutes we'll open it up so you can put up your hand. It's a time for storytelling, it seems to me, which is to say, where are we going? What's going on? What's the past? And what's the future? That seems fundamental to Black Lives Matters, but it's fundamental about the pandemic as well, because people are bewildered. And we as Christians have the story. So exciting. It seems to me it's a time for being incarnate, which is to say, that's what you were saying about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, showing that we take the pain into our own life, going into battle like the king in the Old Testament in the middle of them, carrying the standard, if you like. Not being the expert, whether in HR or furlough or finance or science. In many ways, I felt rather powerless, and yet the opportunity to enable others with a phone call is utterly phenomenal. Let's hear from others, shall we, Robert? Is there something else you're going to say?
You might not be able to see, so I can see. Would someone who has found this an energizing time like to just make a quick comment about that? What and how?
Jane Hiley. Go,
Jane Hiley.
Unmute yourself. Warden of Readers, LLMs here.
Jane, go.
Thank you, Robert. One of the things I found encouraging is that those who are very good in the technology world have suddenly risen to the top. We're very fortunate in Ashted to have quite so many really skilled people who are putting together services which they're putting out on YouTube, and they are reaching Australia and all parts of the world from what they're doing, which is absolutely lovely. And lots of people who perhaps wouldn't contribute in a normal church service because the leadership would be doing it, are being given an opportunity to lead something, prayers or readings or worship slots or this time tomorrow's, all kinds of things. So I'm really positive that this is giving an opportunity to consider who else can contribute. It doesn't just have to be done by the leaders.
Thank you, Jane. So that's not only empowering, but actually spreading it more widely. Just to keep things in proportion, can we have another contribution from someone who's felt energized and felt it's been a positive time as leader? And if I don't get a volunteer,
Graham Osborne.
Thanks, Joe. For me, leadership is about it's about setting a vision and then enrolling others in it, or somehow collating a vision. And what I've found is that it's partly because we left our church in the middle of July last year to go and worship in the hall because of a major reordering project. That made a significant difference in our understanding of ourselves as a church family, and that has been highlighted in pandemic time. But it's about being able to say, let's set a new vision for what church really is about. It's about a community of those seeking to live God's kingdom and living the life of love that Jesus taught us. And to be able to reframe that with people being much, much more open to that, that nuance has been really energizing.
Our myths about self-control have been stripped away, haven't they?
Nick
very
Williams.
Sorry. Okay.
Nick Williams, your chat comment is in the same line as Graham. Do you want to just say something about that?
I think we just generally are so caught up in maintaining and running a church. I think for me, this has been a bit of a spiritual reawakening in terms of what leadership looks like, because I've had to spend less time on rotas and looking after multiple buildings and more time phoning people, having conversations, praying with people over the phone, connecting in morning prayer this morning with a group over Zoom. Just I think reminded me once again of my calling. And of course, actually, we all know this, and that's actually what we're about, but we get subsumed by the business of, as I've put, running, managing church PLC.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
Joe, can we hear from someone? So 20 or so % of you said it's been the opposite experience. This is, I don't know who they were, so this is not putting you on the spot, but actually in the spirit of sharing in one another's pain and joy. Does someone want to name something along that line, that experience of leadership being quite tough?
Susan Watson, I notice, willing to speak. Thank you, Susan.
And for me, it's actually quite a practical thing. It's because my paid role is Children and Families Minister, and I've been furloughed. And I had that sort of just before Easter highlight of the year, obviously, in terms of sharing with children and communicating. All of a sudden my role was whisked away, and I actually wasn't allowed, obviously, completely understandably, to do any of that. So although I'm an ordinand as well, and so but trying to work out what any contribution in some ways I could make, because I don't live in my parish either, in the parish I work at, was really, really quite tricky, and that's taken a few weeks to kind of work out. So I suppose normally I would love to be in the middle of things and helping get things sorted and up and running and organised, and I have been able to contribute in some ways, at least, as time has gone on.
Thank you, Susan.
Now, I see Howard willing to make a contribution. Thank you, Howard. If you could unmute yourself. Howard Blewett, you're still muted.
No, I'm trying to unmute myself. Have I succeeded?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, good. I find it difficult to exercise a ministry where I don't meet anybody. What you put out on the internet entirely depends on people engaging with it. And so you can't be quite so successful in evangelizing. But what has been helpful is that I'm a person who has insisted on going for a walk every day. And I'm not too worried about social distancing. It's interesting how many people want to keep away from me compared with how I want to keep away from them. But if you speak to everybody, and you are so often asked, how are you getting on? And if you say that such success as you have leads you to give thanks to God for the strength you have to cope with all this, then it can open up a conversation. But we so rarely mention the name of Jesus outside of church that that's one of the points I've been trying to push when I've had the opportunity to meet with anybody. But it's been very disabling not to meet people anymore, except disembodied spirits like yourselves.
Yeah. If I can just jump in, thank you, Howard. From empirical observation to theological exploration stroke judgment, which is what this is all about,
quite.
I wonder what that says about our God. Our God longs for encounter.
Indeed.
We long to mediate that kind of encounter.
Yes, it really is for us to create the opportunities which St. Paul encourages us to grasp. Where you have opportunity, do good. Well, to do good is to bring the gospel to people. But if you are locked down, you have very much less opportunity. So you have to look for as many as you can. And when you go out for your walk, speak to every single person you pass. Make some kind of comment. I say, I'm avoiding you, but it's not personal. And any old thing that brings a smile, and it's surprising how often you can get a smile out of people, but do mention God's name in all of this. The evangelism is crucial at this time.
Gertrude, were you waving at me or scratching your nose? Forgive the personal question.
I was wondering, with Bishop Joe saying that God is a God who wants us to listen, I was wondering whether we've been sent the pandemic in order to give us an opportunity to listen to him and make some space. I'm not saying this is divine judgment or anything like that. I'm just saying God might use the opportunity.
And if anybody's interested to think more along those lines, Gertrude is clearly tuned into Walter Brueggemann, who's written a fantastic book about the pandemic. It'll be on the bibliography, called Virus as a Summons to Faith. And he sees it, along with so many calamities in the story of God's people, as being an opportunity, an invitation to return to right relationship with the living God. You know, a call to deeper, more caring, more beneficial mutual relationship.
Joe, could I mention at this point, I think I put another book, interestingly also about the Old Testament, on the bibliography. And there's a quote towards the end that I found really, came across a couple of days ago, found really helpful. And actually it ties together, I think, some of what Graham and Nick were saying. It's pointing out that the wisdom literature, so Job and Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and so on, written towards the end of the Old Testament period, really focus people on the fear of God and the way of wise living. But one of the dangers of the wisdom literature is that it lost contact with two other strands, one of which was the grand narrative of the covenant, and the other of which was the institutions of what we would call Old Testament religion, the temple and so on. And for me, part of the role of leadership is keeping those three aspects together, that the institutional aspect of our faith and the covenant of grace, the grand narrative in which we find ourselves, and the strand of right living, so the sort of moral, ethical, those three need to be kept together. And for me, I earth that in wanting church buildings open because they are a place where we declare the covenant and because they encourage people in right living. So institutional, moral and character formation and theological grand narrative. Things go awry if those three strands aren't kept together. And of course, they are woven together in the canon of the Old Testament.
Robert, you've just offered a beautiful summary, I think, in terms of our call to pastoral leadership at this time there. We're drawing to a close now. I think we were meant to end at 3, but I'm not worried that we've run over a little bit, and you can depart if you need to. Can I just flag another book that I'm only halfway through, but I'm really excited about it. It's Tom Wright has just published a little book called God and the Pandemic. It's one of, he puts in beautiful argument exactly why Robert and I didn't focus this seminar on the theodicy question, which is to say, you know, who sinned? Was it us or was it our parents that God has sent a pandemic? Was it the Chinese or was it the Americans? You know, it's another version of conspiracy theory or blame game. Tom Wright's book, I'm holding it up, but I realize my camera is off because it's the only way to be secure on this.
You're on.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
I mean, he's just such a fantastic biblical scholar. Please lay aside any concerns about whether he's conservative or liberal. He is utterly brilliant at holding the big picture and yet drilling down into Old Testament or New Testament texts and helping exegete them within the big picture. And I think this is a really useful book for your preaching. So anyway, but I'm only halfway through it. So, you know, I'm a half full bishop just at the moment. I think it's time to close. I don't see bundles of questions coming forward on the chat. Let me just say a couple of things by way of closing. One or two books that we've referenced and other things Robert and I recommend we will send out on a mini bibliography, not because we think you've got hours and hours to read, but because you might want to chase some further ideas in a half-hearted way, a bit like me. This is one of a series of webinars. There's one every Wednesday covering different topics. There's no reason why the webinars couldn't stretch beyond July, which is where they're sat at the moment. So in your feedback, if you want to say what you're dying for in Wednesday afternoons like this, please feel free to do so, and we'll try and pay attention. Finally, can I pray for you as we pray together for one another, as we offer our lives to God, as we seek that these circumstances of pandemic bring us to repentance and bring us to seek a fresh encounter with the living God and seek to enable that in others. Lord, would you give us wisdom and strength and imagination and patience as we persist in serving you in challenging times and yet exciting times. I pray that you would empower the leadership of everyone who is gathered here on this Zoom and those whom they seek to lead, that all of us may be enabled to be your worshippers, your witnesses to our world, in order that your glory may be known through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.